Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 100, Sacred Tetris and Other Tidbits. First off, woohoo! 100 episodes! Thank you to everyone who's been listening and following along on this journey so far. You know, when I started this, I really had no idea how long I'd be able to keep up with it, but I appreciate everyone who has encouraged me along the way. This all started in September of 2019, and we're now 4 years in, and, well, we have a ways to go. While I'm thanking people, though, I'd also like to give a big thank you to my wife, Ellen, who's been helping me behind the scenes. You see, she's the one who typically helps read through what I'm going to say, helps edit out a lot of things, and provides reminders of some of the things I tend to forget. She really helps to keep me on track, and I always appreciate the time she puts in to helping to edit the scripts and the questions she asks. Now, we are still talking about the 6th and early 7th centuries during the reign of Kashikiya Hime, aka Suiko Tenno. We've talked about a lot of different aspects of this period, about the conflicts over Nimna on the peninsula, about the rise of the Sui dynasty on the continent, and the importation of various continental goods, including animals, immigrants, and knowledge. That knowledge included new ideas about governance as well as religious practices such as Buddhism, and possibly other religious practices as well, as many of the stories that we saw in the Age of Gods may have analogs on the continent and may just as easily have been coming over with the current crop of immigrants, though it's really hard to say for certain. By the time this is all written down, it's just from time immemorial. At the heart of these changes are 3 individuals. Now, obviously, there's Kashikiya Hime on the throne through a rather intricate and bloody series of events. Then there's Soga no Umako, her maternal uncle, who's been helping to keep the Soga family on top. And, of course, the subject of our last couple episodes, Prince Umeyado, aka Shotoku Taishi. He, of course, is credited with, well, everything, including the very founding of the Japanese state through the 17-article Constitution and the promulgation of Buddhism. This episode, I'd like to tackle some of the little things, some of the stories that maybe didn't make it into other episodes up to this point. For this, we'll mostly look at it in a chronological fashion, more or less. Now, as you may recall, Kashikiya Hime came to the throne in about 593, ruling in the palace of Toyura. This was around the time that the pagoda was erected at Hokoji Temple, and about the time that we're told Shitennoji Temple was erected as well. Kashikiya Hime made Umeyado the crown prince, despite having a son of her own, as we'd mentioned previously, and then in 594, she told Umeyado and Umako to start to promulgate Buddhism, kicking off a temple-building craze that would sweep the nation, or at least the areas ruled by the elites of Yamato. By 596, Hokoji was finished, and in a detail I don't think we touched on when talking about Asukadera back in episode 97, they appointed as commissioner one Zentoku no Omi, or possibly Zentoko, in one reading I found at least. Now, this is a curious name since Zentoku comes across as a decidedly Buddhist name, and, well, they really like to use the character Zen, it feels like, at this time. In fact, it's the same name that the nun, the daughter of Ootomo no Sarehiko no Muraji, took, though the narrative is very clear about gender in both instances, despite them having the exact same Buddhist names. This name isn't exactly unique, however, and it's also the name recorded for the Shilla ruler, Queen Sunduk, whose name uses the same 2 characters, so it's possible that at this time it was just a popular name, or, perhaps people just weren't in the mood to get too creative yet. However, what is particularly interesting to me is that the name Zentoku is then followed by the Kabane of Omi. As you may recall from earlier episodes, a Kabane is a level of rank, but it's associated more with an entire family or lineage group rather than an individual. So while there are times that we've seen personal name plus Kabane in the past, there's usually a surname somewhere in there. In this case, we aren't told the surname, but we know it because we're given the name of Zentoku's father. We're told that he was the son of none other than the Oomi, that is, the great Omi, Soga no Umiko. So, in summary, one of Soga no Umiko's sons took the tonsure and became a monk, and then went on to be the commissioner of the family temple. I bring this little tidbit up because there's something that seems very odd to me and, at the same time, very aristocratic about taking vows, retiring from the world, and yet still being known by your family's title of rank. Often monks are depicted as outside of the civil rank and status system, though there were certainly ranks and titles within the priesthood, and let's face it, if you're a royal prince that takes the tonsure, you're going to have a little bit of sway. Now, I wonder if it read as strange to the 8th century readers, looking back on this period. It certainly seems to illustrate quite clearly how Buddhism at this point was a tool of the elite families, and not just a grassroots movement among the common people. This also further strengthens the idea that Hokoji was the temple of the Soga, and specifically Soga no Umiko. Sure, as a Soga descendant, Prince Umayado may have had some hand in it, but in the end, it was the head of the Soga family who was running the show, and so he appoints one of his own sons as the chief commissioner of the temple. They aren't even trying to hide the connection. In fact, having one of his sons retire and start making merit through Buddhist practice was probably a great PR move as well. Now, we don't hear much from Zentoku after this point, and we really know very little about him. We do know something about the Soga family, and we know that Soga no Umiko has at least one other son. And while we've yet to see him in the narrative, children in the Nihon Shoki are often meant to be neither seen nor heard. Well, Umiko's other son is known to us as Soga no Emishi. Based on when we believe Soga no Emishi was born, however, he would have been a child still when all this was happening, and so Zentoku may have actually been his father's eldest son, taking the reins at Hokoji Temple and likely setting him up to claim a role of spiritual leadership in the new religion of Buddhism. Compare this to what we see later, and also in other places such as Europe, where it's often the second son that's sent into religious life, while the eldest son, the heir, is kept at hand to succeed the father in case anything happens, and to learn about statecraft rather than religion. On the other hand, I am unsure if the monks of this time had, well, any sort of celibacy that was expected of them, and I suspect that even as the temple commissioner, the Terra no Tsukasa, Zentoku was probably keeping his hand in the politics. After all, the Soga family head appears to have been staying near the temple as well, so it isn't like they were packing him off to the high mountains. Moving on, in 601, we're told that Kashikiya Hime was in a temporary palace at a place called Miminashi, and this seems to have been when heavy rains came and flooded the palace site. This probably is referring to the flooding of Toyora Palace, which was, we believe, next to the Asuka River. I wonder then if that wasn't the impetus for, 2 years later in 603, moving the royal palace to Oharida and leaving the old palace buildings to become a nunnery. That Oharida palace there is not thought to have been moved very far away, traditionally just a little ways north, or possibly across the river based on some later scholarship. Not sure, but it wasn't like they were going for a major change of scenery. In 604, with the court operating out of the new Oharida Palace, we see the institution of more continental-style traditions. It included the idea of bowing when you entered or left the palace grounds, going so far as to get on your hands and knees for the bow. Even today, it is customary to bow when entering a room, particularly a traditional room like a dojo or something similar. And it's also customary to bow when you're passing through a torii gate, entering into a sacred space. Of course, that's often just a standing bow from the waist and not a full bow from a seated position. In 605, with more continental culture being imported, we see it affecting fashion as well. In fact, we're told that in this year that Prince Umayado commanded all of the ministers to wear the hirami. The kanji simply translates to pleats, but in clothing terms, this refers to a pleated skirt or apron. We see examples of this in courtly clothing going back to at least the Han Dynasty, if not earlier, typically tied high above the waist and falling all the way down so that only the tips of the shoes are poking out from underneath. We have a bit more on this in the historical clothing section of Sengoku Daimyo website, sengokudaimyo.com, if you want to check it out. I wonder if these wrapped skirts aren't some of what we see in the embroidered Tenju Koku Mandala of Chuguji. Court women would continue to wear some kind of pleated skirt-like garment, which would become the mo, though for men they would largely abandon the faction, except for some very specific ritual outfits. That said, there's still an outfit used for some imperial ceremonies where the hirami still exists. It's red with many continental and what some might consider Taoist symbols, such as dragons, the sun, the moon, etc. That continuation of tradition gives us some idea of what this was and what it may have looked like back in the day. It's also very neat that we're starting to get specific pieces of potentially identifiable clothing information, even if it is only for the court nobles. The year following that, 606, we get the giant Buddha image being installed at Hokoji, aka Asukadera. Or at least we think that is the one they're talking about, as we can't be 100% certain. However, it is traditionally thought to be one and the same. The copper and gold image was commissioned a year prior, along with an embroidered image as well. But when they went to install it, they ran into a slight problem. The statue was too large to fit through the doors of the kondo, the golden image hall. No doubt that caused some embarrassment. It's kind of like ordering furniture that won't fit through the doorway, like a giant couch. No matter how you and your friends try to maneuver it around or up the stairs, just won't go. Well, they were thinking they would have to cut through the doors of the kondo to create more room, and then they'd just fix it afterwards, I guess. Nobody really wanted to do that, though, whether because they thought it would damage the structural integrity of the building or just didn't want to have to put up with an unsightly scar. It isn't exactly clear. Finally, before they took such extreme measures, they called on the original artist, Kuratsukuri no Tori. He's said to be the son of the famous Shiba Tato, and so his family was quite close with the Soga, and he seems to have had quite the eye for geometry, as we're told that he, by way of skill, was able to get it through the doors and into the hall. I don't know if that meant he had to somehow turn it on its side and walk it through, or something else, but whatever it was, it worked. Through Tori's mad Tetris skills, they were able to install the giant Buddha in the hall without cutting through the doorways. For his efforts, Tori was rewarded, and he was raised up to the rank of Dainin, one of the 12 new ranks of the court. He was also given 20 cho worth of water fields, which I assume means something like rice paddies. With the income of those fields, we're told that he invested in a temple of his own, Kongoji, later known as the nunnery of Sakata in Minabuchi. For all that Buddhism was on the rise, the worship of the kami was still going strong as well. In 607, we're told that there was an edict that everyone should worship the kami of heaven and earth, and we're told that all of the noble families complied. I would note that Aston wonders about this entry, as the phrasing looks like something you could have taken right out of Continental records, but at the same time, it likely reflects reality to some extent. It's hard to see the court just completely giving up the traditional kami worship, which would continue to be an important part of court ritual. In fact, it's still unclear just how the new religion of Buddhism was viewed and how many people really understood the Buddha to be anything more than just another type of kami. Later in the same year was the mission to the Sui court, which we discussed in episode 96. The year after, the mission returned to Yamato with the Sui ambassadors, and then in 609, those ambassadors returned to the Sui court. These were the missions of that infamous letter where the Yamato court addressed the Sui emperor as an equal. From the child of heaven in the land where the sun rises to the child of heaven in the land where the sun sets. It's still one of my favorite little pieces of history, and I constantly wonder if Yamato didn't understand the difference in scale or if they just didn't care. Either way, some really powerful vibes coming off that whole thing. That same year that the Sui ambassadors were going back to their court, There was another engagement with foreigners. In this case, the official on the island of Tsukushi, aka Kyushu, reported to the Yamato court that 2 priests from Baekje, along with 10 other priests and 75 laypersons, had anchored in the harbor of Ashigita in the land of Higo, which is to say the land of He that was farther from Yamato, on the western side of Kyushu. Ashigita, you may recall, came up in episode 89 in reference to the Baekje monk, and I use that term monk somewhat loosely, named Nichira, aka Illa. There, Nichira was said to descend from the lord of Ashigita, who himself was said to be Arisatung, a name that appears to be a Korean, possibly Baekje title. So now we have a Baekje ship harboring in a land that was once ruled by a family identified, at least in their names or titles, as having come from, or at least having some ties with Baekje. This isn't entirely surprising, as it wouldn't have taken all that much effort for people versed in the sea to cross from one side to the other, and particularly during the period before there was a truly strong central government, it's easy to see that there may have been lands in the archipelago that had ties to Baekje and elsewhere, just as we believe there were some lands on the peninsula that had ties back to Yamato. One more note before we get to the heart of the matter is the title of the person who reported all these Baekje goings-on. Aston translates the title as the Viceroy of Tsukushi, and the kanji reads Dazai, as in the Dazaifu, or the government of the Dazai. There is kana that translates the title as O Mikoto Mochi, the great august thingholder per Aston, who takes this as a translation rather than as a strict transliteration. In other words, they probably didn't refer to this individual as O Mikoto Mochi, but who knows? Now, this is the first time that this term, Dazai, has popped up in the history, and it will appear more and more in the future. We know that at least later, the Dazaifu was the Yamato court's representative government in Kyushu. The position wasn't new. It goes back to the various military governors sent there in previous reigns, but this is the first time that that specific phrasing is used, and unfortunately, we don't even know much about who it was referring to. The position, however, would become an important part of the Yamato government apparatus as it provided an extension of the court's power over Kyushu, which could otherwise have easily fallen under the sway of others, much as Iwai tried to do when he tried to ally with Shilla and take Tsukushi by force. Given the importance of Kyushu as the entry point for the archipelago, it was in the court's best interest to keep it under their control. Now, getting back to the ship with the Baekje priests on it, the passengers claimed they were on their way to Wu, or Kure, presumably headed to the Yangtze River region. Given the number of Buddhist monasteries in the hills around the Yangtze River, it is quite believable, though, of course, by this time, the Wu dynasty was long gone. What they had not prepared for was the new Sui dynasty. As I said, there was a civil war of some kind going on, and so they couldn't land and were subsequently blown off course in a storm. Eventually, they limped along to Ashigita Harbor, where they presumably undertook rest and a chance to repair their vessels. It's unclear to me exactly what civil war they were referring to, and it may have just been a local conflict that didn't get recorded elsewhere. There would be rebellions south of the Yangtze River a few years later, but no indication that it was this, just a bit out of context. We know that the Sui dynasty suffered, and it wouldn't last another decade before being dismantled and replaced by the Tang dynasty in 618. And there were also ongoing conflicts with Goguryeo and in the area of modern Vietnam, which were draining the Sui's resources and could possibly be related to some of these issues. If so, though, it's hard to see an exact correlation to the civil war mentioned in the text. Given all this, 2 court nobles, Naniwa no Kishi no Tokomaro and Fumibito no Tatsu, were sent to Kyushu to see what had happened. And once they learned the truth, they helped send the visitors on their way. However, 10 of the priests asked to stay in Yamato, and they were sent to be housed at the Soga family temple of Hokoji. As you may recall, 10 monks was the necessary number to hold a proper ordination ceremony. So, what do you think of that? Now, in 610, another couple of monks showed up, this time from Goguryeo. They were actually sent, as we're told, as tribute. We're told that one of them was well read, specifically that he knew the 5 classics, but also that he understood how to prepare various paints and pigments. A lot of paint and pigments were based on available materials as well as what was known at the time, and so it's understandable to me why you might have that noted as a remarkable skill. We're also told that he made mills, likely a type of hand mill. These can be easily used for helping to crush and blend medicines, but I suspect it could just as easily be used to crush the various ingredients for different pigments. A type of hand mill where you roll a wheel in a narrow channel, forward and back, is still in use today throughout Asia. Speaking of medicines, in 611, on the 5th day of the 5th month, the court went out to gather herbs. They assembled at the pond of Fujiwara, the pond of the wisteria field, and they set out at sunrise. We're told that their clothing matched their official cap colors, which was based on their rank, so that would seem to indicate they were dressed in their court outfits. In this case, though, they also had hair ornaments made of gold, leopard's tails, or birds. That leopard's tail, assuming the description is accurate and it was the real thing, is particularly interesting as it would have had to have come from the continent. This ritual gathering of herbs would be repeated on the 5th day of the 5th month, both in 612 and in 614. And if that date seems familiar, you might be thinking of the modern holiday of Tango no Sekku, aka Kodomo no Hi, that is to say, Boys' Day, or the more gender-neutral Children's Day. It is part of a series of celebration in Japan known today as Golden Week, when there are so many holidays crammed together that people get roughly a week off of work, meaning that a lot of travel tends to happen in that period. While the idea of Boys' Day probably doesn't come about until the Kamakura period, Tango no Sekku has long been one of the 5 seasonal festivals of the court, the Gosekku. These include New Year's Day, the 3rd day of the 3rd month, later to become the Doll Festival or Girls' Day, the 7th day of the 7th month during Tanabata, and the 9th day of the 9th month. As you can see, that is 1-1, 3-3, 5-5, 7-7, and 9-9. Interestingly, they skipped over 11-11, possibly because that was in the wintertime, based on the old calendar anyway, and people were just trying to stay warm. Early traditions of Tango no Sekku include women gathering irises to protect the home. That could connect to the practice here of picking herbs by the court, and indeed many people connect the origins of the Tango no Sekku back to this reign specifically because of these references, though there's very little said about what they were doing other than picking herbs in their fancy outfits. We're given a few more glimpses into the lives of the court in a few other entries. In 612, for instance, we have a banquet thrown for the high functionaries. This may have been a semi-regular occasion, but this particular incident was memorable for a couple poems that were bandied back and forth between Sogono Umako and Kashikiya Hime. He toasted her, and she responded with a toast to the sons of the Soga. Later that year, they held a more somber event, as Kitashi Hime was reinterred. Now, she was the sister to Sogono Umako, consort of Nunakura Futodamashiki, aka Kinmei Tenno, and mother to both Tachibana no Toyoi, aka Yonmei Tenno, and Kashikiya Hime, Suiko Tenno. She was reburied with her husband at his tomb in Hinokuma. During this period, various nobles made speeches, and kicking off the event was Abe no Uchi no Omi no Tori, who made offerings to her spirit, including around 15,000 utensils and garments, the kinds of things that archaeologists would love to dig up in some of these tombs, if they were allowed. Then the royal princes spoke, each according to rank, but we aren't given just what they said. After that, Nakatomi no Miyatokoro no Muraji no Omaro gave the eulogy of the Oomi, presumably speaking on Umako's behalf, though it isn't exactly clear to me why, though Umako was certainly getting on in years. Then Sakaibe no Omi no Marise delivered the written eulogies of the other families. And maybe this was just something to keep them from getting up there and speaking extemporaneously? Not sure. And here we get an interesting glimpse into court life as we see a report that both Nakatomi no Omaro and Sakaibe no Marise apparently delivered their speeches with great aplomb, and the people listening were quite appreciative. However, they did not look quite so fondly on the speechifying of Abe no Tori, and they said that he was less than skillful, let us say. And consider that for a moment. If you already find public speaking to be something you dread, and many people would honestly rather die than have to speak in public, well, imagine if your entire reputation hung on ensuring that every word was executed properly. A single misstep or a bad day, and suddenly you're recorded in the national history as having been just the worst. In fact, his political career seems to have tanked, as we don't hear much about him after that. 612 also saw more immigrants bringing more art and culture. The first was a man from Baekje. He did not look well. He had white circles under his eyes, we're told, possibly indicating ringworm or some other infection. It was so bad that the people on the ship with him were thinking of throwing him off the ship or putting him on an island to fend for himself. He protested that his looks were not contagious and no different than the white patches of color you might see on horses or cattle, which, not sure if that was true or not, but hey, it seemed to work. Moreover, he had a talent, he said, for painting figures and mountains, and he drew figures of the legendary Mount Sumeru and of the Bridge of Wu during the period of the Southern Courts, and the people were so taken by these images that they forestalled tossing him overboard. He was eventually known as Michiko no Takumi, though more colloquially he was known as Shikomaro, which was basically a nickname calling him ugly because judging people based on appearance was totally still a thing. The other notable immigrant that year was also a man of Baekje. He's known to us as Mimachi, or perhaps Mimashi or Mimaji. He claimed to know the music and dancing of the Wu court, or at least some continental dynasty, probably from around the Yangtze River region. He settled in Sakurai and took on students who were basically forced to learn from him, as if a piano teacher appeared and all the children went to learn, but now it isn't just your parents that have their high expectations, but the very state is telling you to do it. So, yeah, no pressure, sure. Now eventually, Manu no Obito no Deshi, whose name literally means student or disciple, so gotta wonder about that, and Imaki no Ayabito no Seibun learned the teachings and passed them down to others. And this would appear to be the masked dances known as gigaku. If you know anything about early Japanese music and dance, you may have heard of gagaku, bugaku, and no theater. Gagaku is the courtly music with roots in apparently indigenous Japanese music, as well as various continental sources from the Korean peninsula all the way down to Southeast Asia. Indeed, the musical records we have in Japan are often the only remaining records of what some of the continental music of this time might have sounded like, even though the playing style and flourishes have changed over the centuries, and many scholars have used the repertoire of the Japanese court to help work backwards to try and recreate some of that continental music. The dances that you often see with gagaku musical accompaniment are known today as bugaku, and most of that was codified in the later years of the Heian era around the 12th century. Then there's the famous masked theater known as No, which had its origins in a variety of traditions going back to at least the 8th century and really brought together around the 14th century. All of these traditions, however, are preceded by gigaku, this form of masked dance that came over in the 7th century. Gigaku claims its roots in the area of Wu rather than Tang, implying that it goes to the traditions of the southern courts of the Yangtze River region. Gigaku spread along with the rest of continental culture, along with the spread of Buddhism and other ideas. From what we can tell, it was a dominant form of music and dance for the court, and many of the masks that we used are preserved in temple storehouses, such as the famous show sewing at the Todaiji in Nara. However, as the centuries rolled by, gigaku was eventually replaced at court by bugaku-style dances, though it continued to be practiced up through at least the 14th century. Unfortunately, I know of no gigaku dances that survived intact into the modern day, and we're left with the elaborate masks, some illustrations of dancers, and a few descriptions of what it was like. That seems to be it. Now, from what we can tell, gigaku, also known as kuregaku or kure no utamai, meaning music or music and dances of Wu, is first noted back in the reign of Nunakura Futodamashiki, aka Kimmei Tenno, but it wasn't until the reign of Kashikiya Hime that we actually see someone coming over and clearly imparting knowledge of the dances and music. That, of course, was Mimashi, mentioned above. We then see the dances mentioned at various temples, including Horyuji, Todaiji, and others. Of course, as with many such things, Shotoku Taishi is given credit for spreading gigaku through the Buddhist temples, and the two do seem to have gone hand in hand, whether Shotoku Taishi had anything to do with it or not. We know a little bit about the dances from the masks and various writings. The masks are not random, and a collection of gigaku masks will generally have the same set of characters. These characters appear to have been organized in a traditional order. A performance would start with a parade and a sutra reading, which I have to wonder if that was original or perhaps added as they grew more connected to the Buddhist temple establishment. And then there was a lion dance, where a young cub would pacify an adult lion. Lion dances in various forms continue to be found throughout East Asia. Then the characters come into play and there are various stories about them. For example, the Duke of Wu and people of the Hu Western regions, that is to say, the non-Han people of the western part of what is now China and Central Eurasia. Some of these performances appear to be serious, while others may have been humorous interludes, like when a demon assaults the character of Rikishi with a man's genitals while calling for the woman of Wu. That brings to mind the later tradition of Aikyogen, similarly humorous or lighthearted episodes acted out during no plays to help break up the dramatic tension and, let's face it, possibly even wake up the audience. Many of the aspects of gigaku would go on to influence the later styles of court music and dance. Bugaku is thought to have some of its origins in masked gigaku dancers performing to the various styles of what became known as gagaku music. There are also examples of some of the characters making their way into other theatrical traditions, such as sarugaku and eventually no and even folk theater. These hints have been used to help artists reconstruct what gigaku might have been like. One of the key aspects of gigaku is that for all they were telling stories, other than things like the recitation of the sutras, the action of the story appears to have been told strictly through pantomime in the dances. This was accompanied by the musicians who played a variety of musical instruments during the performance that would provide the musical cues for the dancers/actors. There was no dialogue, however, but the names of the various characters appear to have been well known, and based on the specifics of the masks, one could tell who was who and what was going on. This is similar to how, in the West, there were often stock characters in things like English mummers' plays or the Commedia dell'arte of the Italian city-states, though in gigaku, these characters would not speak at all, and their story would be conveyed simply through pantomime, music, and masks. I'm also thinking of the Thai tradition of kon, which also has dancers in masks portraying various stories of the Ramayana or Ramakien. Now, there have been various attempts to reconstruct gigaku. Notably, there was an attempt in the 1980s in coordination with a celebration of the anniversary of Todaiji in Nara, and it appears that Tenri University may continue that tradition. There was also another revival by famed Kyogen actor Nomura Manojo, uncle to another famous Kyogen actor turned movie star, Nomura Mansai. Manojo called his style Shin Gigaku, which seems to be translated as either True Gigaku or New Gigaku, and he took that on tour to various countries. You can find an example of his performance from the Silk Road Theater at the Smithsonian Folklife Festival in Washington, D.C. back in 2002, as well as some of his other performers out there on the tubes. It does appear that he's changed things up just a little bit based on his layout of the dances, but it is an interesting interpretation nonetheless. Now, we may never know truly what gigaku looked and sounded like, but it certainly had an impact on theatrical and musical traditions of Japan, and for that alone, it perhaps deserves to be mentioned. And with that, I think we'll stop right there, at least for now. There is more to get through, and so we'll certainly have a part 2 as we continue to look at the events of this reign. There are stories of gods and omens. There's contact with an island off the southern coast of Kyushu. There are more trips to the Sui court. Much of that is coming up. Until then, though, I'd like to thank you once again. I can hardly believe we reached 100 episodes, and it comes just as we're about to close out the year. As usual, I'll plan for a recap episode over New Year's, and then I'll plan to get back into everything the episode after that, but this closes out the year. I hope everyone has a wonderful new year, however you celebrate, and as always, thank you for listening and for all of your support. Remember, if you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we do have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/Sengoku Daimyo, or find the links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we will have some more discussion on topics from this episode. Also, feel free to tweet at us at Sengoku Podcast or reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can also email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. And that's all for now. Thank you again, and I'll see you next episode and next year on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.